My mother walked out on our family when I was 9 and never called. I found her 40 years later, and what she told me I was never prepared to hear. She opened the door of a small house in coastal Oregon and looked at me the way you look at a stranger, except with a quality underneath the stranger look that was not entirely stranger, and I stood on her porch at 51 years old and felt 9 years old in a way I had spent 42 years convincing myself I no longer could. She had gray hair, cut short, the kind of gray that comes from stopping rather than from age, and she was wearing a green cardigan and holding a coffee mug, and the ordinary domesticity of her, the complete, intact, continuing existence of her, hit me somewhere below the ribcage with a force I had not prepared for adequately, despite having prepared for everything else with considerable thoroughness. She said, "Can I help you?" Not because she didn't know who I was. I watched her figure it out in real time across approximately 3 seconds. The recognition moving through her face like weather, like something she had been expecting and dreading simultaneously for a very long time. She said it because she needed the 3 seconds. I understood this. I had needed 42 years. I said, "My name is Delia Asante Brewster." I said, "You are my mother." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she stepped back and opened the door wider, and I walked into the house where she had been living her continuing, intact, ordinary life, and I sat down at her kitchen table. And she poured me coffee without asking whether I wanted it, which was the most maternal thing she had done for me in 42 years. I had been a family law attorney for 23 years when I found her. I mention this because it is relevant both to how I found her and to how I processed what I found, which is to say that I brought to the search a professional set of tools and a professional set of compartments that are excellent for containing things while you work on them and are not, it turns out, adequate for the particular category of thing I was about to be handed. I had not been searching continuously. I want to be accurate about this. I had not spent 4 decades obsessively tracking my mother. I had spent 4 decades living my life, building a career, on marrying a man named Kwesi, who was a secondary school history teacher and who was the most patient person I have ever encountered, raising 2 children who were now adults, and periodically, in the way that orphaned things periodically do, returning to the question of where she had gone and why. My father, Obadiah Brewster, had raised us, me and my brother Quincy, who was 6 when she left, with the specific competence of a man who had decided that grief was not a useful operating mode and had converted it instead into function. He made our lunches. He attended every school event. He drove us to piano lessons and orthodontist appointments and never, in my memory, spoke badly of her. He said, when we asked, that she had needed to leave. He said this in a tone that was both final and somehow kind. Us and I had spent 4 decades interpreting those 5 words and had arrived at approximately 11 different meanings, none of which turned out to be correct. She left on a Tuesday in March when I was 9 years old, and Quincy was 6. This is what I knew from memory. She was there at breakfast, she was not there when I came home from school, and my father was sitting at the kitchen table with a stillness that I recognized, even at 9, as a different kind of stillness than his normal stillness. He told us she had gone away. He told us she would not be coming back. He did not cry. I cried enough for both of us, and then more than enough. And eventually, because 9-year-olds are resilient in the specific way of things that have no choice, I stopped crying and started adapting. Quincy, who was 6, adapted differently and faster. Partly because 6-year-olds are even more resilient, and partly because he had fewer memories to miss, which I used to envy him for, and now understand was its own particular loss. We did not talk about her much as we grew up. She became one of the subjects that existed in our household in the specific way of things that are present through their absence. Not forbidden, not suppressed, but somehow not available either, like a room in a house where the door was closed and you knew better than to knock. I had knocked twice in adulthood, both times with my father, both times receiving the same 5 words, she needed to leave, and the same tone that was both final and somehow kind. Aiden and I had learned not to push, because pushing my father past what he was willing to give felt like a cruelty. I was not willing to commit against a man who had given everything. My father died 4 years before I found her. He died at 82 of a stroke that was fast, and, the doctor said, without significant pain, which was the kind of sentence that is true and insufficient simultaneously. He left behind his house, his books, his carefully maintained garden, and a small wooden box in the back of his bedroom wardrobe that I found 6 months after he died, when I was finally able to go through his things. The box contained, among other items, a watch that had belonged to his own father, photographs of his parents, a letter in handwriting I did not recognize, a document, a legal document, a divorce decree I filed and finalized 23 years after my mother left, which meant she had not been legally divorced from my father for the first 23 years of her absence, and more significantly, which contained an address, a Portland, Oregon address, dated 20 years before I opened the box. I sat on the floor of my father's bedroom holding this document and understood several things simultaneously. That my father had known where she was for at least 20 years before he died, that he had chosen not to tell us, and that by leaving the document in a box in his wardrobe where I would find it after he was gone, he had made a specific and deliberate choice about the timing of our access to this information. He had decided that we could have it after he was no longer there to be part of the conversation it would produce. I sat with this for a long time. Then I started doing what I do, which is build a case. My professional skills produced results quickly. 20-year-old Portland address, tax records, voter registration, property records, the public documentation trail of a person living an ordinary continuing life. She had moved twice since the Portland address, which was how I ended up at the coastal Oregon house rather than in a city apartment. Her name, the name she was using, was Lorraine Fitch, not Brewster, not the name I had been carrying my whole life. Lorraine Fitch, 68 years old, retired librarian, resident of a small coastal town. She had no criminal record. She paid her taxes. She had a Facebook account that was mostly photographs of the ocean and occasional book recommendations. I had found her Facebook before I found the address, but which meant that before I ever knocked on her door, I had seen her face in the present tense. Gray-haired, alive, holding a dog on a beach, captioning a sunset. I had sat in my office in the city at 49 years old, looking at photographs of my living mother holding a dog, and I had felt something that I did not have language for, and that my therapist, a woman named Dr. Adiola Nwosu, who had been working with me for 11 years, and who had heard everything, called a complicated grief response to evidence of continued existence. I called it something less clinical. I called it unbearable, and then I called it information, and I made a plan. Which is what I do. I did not tell Kwesi about the box or the document or the address for 3 months. I want to be honest about this, rather than present myself as having handled everything correctly, because I did not handle everything correctly, and the honest account is the only useful one. I kept it to myself because I needed to decide what to do with it before I could talk about it, and deciding required sitting with it. And sitting with it required privacy, and I had spent 42 years being very competent at managing the particular category of feelings that my mother's absence produced, which meant I had also spent 42 years being somewhat resistant to allowing those feelings to be witnessed. My therapist, Dr. Nwosu, would say I had been managing rather than processing, which is a distinction she had been making for 11 years, and which I had been acknowledging intellectually and resisting emotionally for approximately the same period. I told Kwesi everything on a Sunday evening in late October, 3 months after finding the box, sitting at our kitchen table with the divorce decree and the Facebook printouts and the address between us. He listened the entire way through without speaking, which is one of the specific gifts of a 26-year marriage to someone who understands that some things require complete reception before they can receive a response. When I finished, he said, "What do you need? Not what do you want to do? What do you need?" I said, "I need to go there." He said, "I know." He said, "I'll come if you want me to." I said, "I need to do this part alone." He said, "I know that too." He made tea. We sat together. That was enough for that night. I drove to Oregon in late November, alone, which was correct. The drive took most of a day, and I used it the way I use long drives, which is to think without interruption, to let the landscape provide a neutral backdrop for internal work without requiring engagement. I had prepared for the meeting with the thoroughness I brought to difficult depositions, had thought through every possible version of what she might say, had prepared responses, had considered the most likely emotional outcomes, and planned for them. This preparation was both useful and completely inadequate. The useful part was that I arrived at her door with a functional version of myself rather than a collapsed one. The inadequate part was that the conversation we had was not any version of the conversation I had imagined, and no amount of preparation can adequately equip you for information you have never considered receiving, which is the category my mother's information fell into entirely. We sat at her kitchen table for approximately 4 hours. Her dog, a small brown terrier named Basil, who apparently had no concerns about strangers, put his head in my lap within the first 10 minutes and stayed there. I found this both incongruous and stabilizing. My mother made coffee, and then tea, and then coffee again, and her hands moved around these tasks with the specific energy of someone who needed things to do with their hands during a conversation they had been preparing for and dreading simultaneously for a very long time. She did not immediately explain herself. She asked about me. She asked about Quincy. She asked about our father. And when I told her he had died 4 years ago, something moved across her face that I watched carefully and that I could not immediately name, but that I have thought about many times since. She said, "I knew he was sick." She said it quietly. I said, "How did you know?" She said, "He wrote to me." She said, "We stayed in contact." She said it the way you say something you know will require a pause to be absorbed, and she gave me the pause. And I sat in it and thought about my father's 5 words. She needed to leave. And about the document in the box, and about the deliberate timing of his decision to leave it where I would find it after he was gone. And I understood that I was about to receive a story that my father had known and had carried and had decided was not his to tell, and that this decision, whatever I eventually thought of it, Bond had been the most significant one he had made in 42 years of raising us. What she told me over the following 3 hours, I have not shared with many people. And what I am going to share here, I am going to share accurately, because accuracy is the only form of respect available to me in this specific situation. My mother had left because my father had asked her to. Not in an argument, not in cruelty, not as a rejection. He had asked her to leave because she was sick in a way that neither of them had fully named yet in 1982, in a way that did not have the name it has now. And my father had believed, incorrectly, she told me, incorrectly, but not without some foundation in what the doctors of 1982 were telling them, that her staying would harm us. She had a psychiatric condition, like the kind that in 1982 was described in language so inadequate and so stigmatizing that she spent years believing the description rather than questioning it. She had had an episode, a breakdown, in the months before she left, and the two of them, she and my father together, sitting at that kitchen table in the house where we grew up, the same kitchen table where I ate breakfast the morning of the day she didn't come home, had made the decision that she would go, that she would get help somewhere else, away from us, where her illness would not touch us in the ways they both believed it would. She said, "He was trying to protect you." She said, "I believed he was right." She said, "I have spent 40 years knowing he was wrong and being unable to undo it." And I put my coffee cup down on her table and looked at her and thought about a 9-year-old girl coming home from school to find her father sitting with a different kind of stillness, and about a father who had spent 40 years saying she needed to leave, as if those 5 words were the full and final story, and about a mother sitting in a coastal Oregon house with a small brown dog and the specific face of a person who has been carrying something for too long. I did not say anything for a long time. She did not fill the silence. There was more. There is always more when a story is 42 years old and has had 42 years to accumulate its complications. After she left, she had received treatment. Real treatment, the kind that worked, seemed the kind that 1982 couldn't provide, but 1989 began to provide as the field changed, and the language changed, and the understanding changed. She had recovered in ways that she described with the specific precision of someone who has spent decades doing the work of understanding their own interior. She had wanted to come back. She had called my father. She had called more than once. And my father, with whatever combination of love and fear and certainty, and possibly some fraction of his own grief had gone into the decision, had told her that coming back would be damaging to us, to the lives we had built, to the equilibrium he had constructed. And she had believed him, again, because she had spent 10 years believing his assessments of her capacity and found it hard to stop even when she had recovered enough to question them. She had made a life. Lorraine Fitch, retired librarian, small coastal town, dog named Basil. She had made a life that was real and hers, and which she did not apologize for because it was the only life available to her after the choices that had been made by both of them, and she had not expected absolution and was not asking for it. She was explaining. This was the distinction she made explicitly and that I have thought about many times since. She was not asking to be forgiven, she was asking to be understood. And she understood these were different requests and that I was under no obligation to fulfill either. I called my brother from her driveway. I sat in my car after 4 hours at her table and called Quincy, who was 48 years old and lived in Atlanta and had his own 42 years of organized absence on this subject, I told him everything while he was quiet in the way he had been quiet about this specific subject since he was 6 years old. He said eventually, "She was sick." I said, "Yes." He said, "Dad sent her away because she was sick." I said, "That's the bones of it." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Did he know she recovered?" I said, "Yes." He said, "And he still kept her away?" I said, "That's what she says." He said, "Do you believe her?" I sat with that. I said, "Yes." He said, "I need some time." I said, "Take it." We stayed on the phone without speaking for a while after that, two middle-aged people sitting with the specific reconfiguration of a story they had each spent their lives building into a shape that allowed them to function, discovering that the shape was not the full shape and had never been. Quincy said finally, "He was a good father." And I said, "I know." He said, "He was also wrong." I said, "I know that too. These things existed simultaneously, and neither of them canceled the other. We did not know what to do with that yet. We are still, honestly, working on it." I drove back through coastal Oregon with the late November landscape moving past the windows and tried to locate what I was feeling, which was a thing I had spent my professional life helping other people do, and which was, when applied to myself, considerably more difficult than the professional version. What I identified was this: I had gone to Oregon with 42 years of a specific grief. The grief of abandonment, which has a particular shape and which had organized itself into something manageable, something I could live around if not through. I was driving home with a different grief, which was the grief of a story that turned out to be more complicated than abandonment and less comfortable in the ways that complexity is always less comfortable than simplicity. Abandonment is one kind of loss. Learning that the abandonment was the product of two frightened people doing the best they could with the information and limitations they had in 1982, and getting it wrong in ways that could not be undone, is a different kind of loss. Not lesser, not greater, different. I drove and thought and did not arrive at resolution, which Dr. Nwosu would have told me was correct and appropriate. Resolution was not the goal. The goal was the accurate account. The goal was the full story. I had the full story now, or closer to the full story than I had ever had. Oh, and it was not the story I had spent 42 years constructing, and it was the one I would spend the rest of my life with, and that was simply the reality, and I was going to have to be large enough to hold it. I went back to see Dr. Nwosu the week after I returned, which was not our regular schedule, but which she accommodated in the way of someone who had been waiting for this particular session for 11 years. I told her everything, and she listened in the specific way she listened, which was complete and without urgency. And at the end of the account, she said, "You've been managing an absence for 42 years. Now you have to learn to live with a presence." I thought about this for a long time. I asked her what the difference was. She said, "An absence is something you can define by its edges. A presence requires you to keep adjusting your understanding because it keeps showing you new information." I said, "That's harder." She said, "Most things that are real are harder." She also said, because she is the kind of therapist who does not let important things pass without naming them, that my father had made decisions on my behalf and Quincy's behalf that were not his decisions to make. That whatever his intentions, and she acknowledged them as loving, as genuinely motivated by protection, he had deprived us of something that belonged to us. A mother, the knowledge of her, the ability to make our own choices about what to do with her continued existence. This was the part that I had been sitting with most carefully, and that was the hardest to hold alongside the love I had for my father, which was real and large and undiminished by this new information. Holding both. That was the work. I made a second trip to Oregon in the spring. This time I brought Queasy. I did not bring Quincy, who was still in his own process, and who would make his own trip in his own time, which he did, 8 months later, by himself, and which is his story to tell rather than mine. Quincy met my mother at her kitchen table with the grace that was his natural operating mode and which I had spent 26 years being grateful for. And Basil put his head in Queasy's lap within the same 10-minute window he had used with me, which I took as a sign of something, possibly only that Basil had no real discernment about whose lap to inhabit, but which I chose to interpret more favorably. My mother and Quasi talked about books, because she was a retired librarian and he was a history teacher, and they had the overlap of people who have spent their lives in the company of words and the stories they carry. I sat at her table and watched this and felt something that I can only describe as the specific strangeness of a present that could not have been imagined from the past it grew from. My mother, her kitchen table, her dog, my husband, all of us alive, all of us there in the coastal Oregon afternoon. It was not the family I had grown up in. It was not a restoration of something lost. It was something different, smaller and newer and more tentative, and it was real. And I had decided that real was what I was going to prioritize over perfect. She sent me a letter after that second visit, handwritten, 6 pages. Wasn't it the kind of letter that people write when they have spent decades composing it in their heads and are finally putting it on paper? I will not quote from it here because it is private, and because privacy is one of the things that matters to me about this story. What I will say is that she said the things in it that she had been unable to say at the kitchen table with Queasy there, and with the dog, and with the particular social architecture of a meeting that was still new enough to require management. She wrote about 1982 and about what she understood now that she had not understood then. She wrote about the years of recovery, and the years of wanting to come back, and the years of believing my father when he said she shouldn't. Oh, she wrote about building Lorraine Fitch out of the wreckage of the person she had been, and about all the things she had hoped for us from a distance. She ended with something I have thought about every day since I read it, which I am going to share because it is not private. It is, I think, the only true thing, the thing that everything else in this story was moving toward. She wrote, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not sure forgiveness is the right word for what I'm hoping for. What I'm hoping for is that you'll let me be real to you. Not the story you've been telling yourself for 40 years. Not a villain, not a ghost. Just a person who failed you in ways I can't undo, and who is still here, and who loves you, and who would very much like, if you're willing, need to spend whatever time we have left being something closer to what we should have been." I folded the letter and put it in the same wooden box where my father had kept the divorce decree, which felt like the right place for it. Not a burial, but a keeping, a record of the full thing. All of it together in one place where I could return to it. My father's decisions and their costs, my mother's survival and its costs. The story that is more complicated than the one I had, and that is the only one I have. I kept it. I keep it. That is what you do with the things that are real.